Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Loud Little Ducky. We are finishing up our witnesses in the Karen Reed trial. And today we're going to be talking about Dr. Laposata, who was a very important witness. Didn't know how she was going to come off at first. She was very soft spoken. I don't know if the jury could hear, but I know we could hear online. It sounded like she was struggling to breathe. I don't know if she has asthma or what was going on, but this woman that looked, maybe quiet and everything like that, she ended up being a firecracker. So first impressions aren't always right. Um, so she was a forensic pathologist. She was a medical examiner. She has been board certified for 35 to 40 years. She was the chief medical examiner for Rhode Island for at least 12 years. She has taught classes on pattern recognition. She's a professor as well. She reviewed tons and tons of photos in this case, even the real estate photos of 34 Fairview, because remember, the Alberts sold their home. So the real estate people went in and took pictures. So she even looked at those photos. Alan Jackson did her direct. They talked about that John O'Keefe had a counter coup brain injury, which just means, back, forward, back, when he fell back and hit his head, that caused brain swelling, which looks to have pushed the brainstem down, and it could be a harbinger of death. The brainstem was pushed down in a hole of the skull that compresses the area, causes the brainstem herniation. And the brainstem controls the breathing. There was bleeding in the brain, broken blood vessels, skull fractures as well. And she says that this injury would have caused immediate unconsciousness and about in 15 to 20 minutes later, death, in her opinion. She said that after the head injury, there was no purposeful movement, could move after that. And then the heart rate would decrease and the breathing would decrease as well, to eventually both of those stopping. She talked about the pattern of the wound can help, police in their investigation. You can tell by the wound, like, is it a depressed skull? In this case, there wasn't, was it a screwdriver? Was it a hammer? Was it scissors? A gunshot, a knife, things that you can tell by injuries that can further lead you to how something happened. She thinks that he hit his head on a ridge surface. The granularity wound goes from the top down, so the wound went this way, basically. Which is interesting because if it goes from the top down, and you think about the hat, well, if he fell on his hat wouldn't go top down, it would go this way. So the hat going up, if he fell backwards, leaving that impression, it wouldn't be going in the correct direction for her. Um, and the granularity is something that Hank Brennan gets mixed up on later. He's thinking like grainy and pebble and dirt, and that's how it got grainy and looks grainy, but that's not what she's talking about. Um, they're not allowed to talk about the inside of the home. So Alan Jackson isn't allowed to ask about the inside of the home or show pictures of it. They talk about him slamming his head back and not being able to move afterwards. In the beginning, I thought, well, could his hat strap have caused that? But no, his hat strap wouldn't have been able to cause that. She says this one, like flat ground, a flat ground surface wouldn't have been able to cause the pattern. A flat ground would have caused a star shape, which I remember hearing from, I believe it was Scorty Bello, about a star shape. But John O'Keefe's head wound is like a J shape. But she says that John O'Keefe does not have the star pattern. They move into talking about hypothermia. She says John O'Keefe didn't have hypothermia because while, yes, a body could cool down due to the cold, when a body dies, the body temperature drops as well. And when they took his temperature at the hospital, it was rectally 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was when they tried to warm him up. They talk about the Wisniewski spots, which happen when skin ulcers, small blood vessels break. Talk about alive as body gets colder and colder. And you need that to happen. You need the Wisniewski spots to happen while they're alive and the body is getting colder and colder. They start to form because they are in an acidic environment, which is of the stomach, and they look like small, like black dots. They talk about, in the gastric mucosa, opening up the stomach lining, and the gastric mucosa is that first cell, the first cells lining of the stomach. But she's saying that he didn't really have any of these Wisniewski spots, which Scorty Bello said she thought he had some, but maybe only 10%, which is very abnormal for hypothermia. She just put, in my opinion, she put hypothermia because maybe she saw a little bit of it, but then she also, because he was left out in the snow, she just put that as a secondary that it could be caused from that. I don't know that she is 100% sold on hypothermia. Then they get into talking about the Lucas machine, which is the automatic machine that can do CPR. And how sometimes that can leave certain looks to things. They move into talking about the arm, and the arm abrasions in John O'Keefe happened when he was alive. She wasn't allowed to testify about it being those abrasions on his arm being from a dog. She was only allowed to say animal, which to me seems ridiculous because everybody knows that we're talking about a dog, so it's not like it's a secret. If they were gonna say animal, they should have done that at the beginning of the trial with all witnesses, but okay, it was an animal. Can't say dog. Oh, okay. Then they talk about, are the wounds pre-mortem or post-mortem? Did they happen when he was alive or when he was dead? Um, she says pre-mortem, when he was alive, because they have a reddish look to them, and they are red because the heart is pumping, and when you have those abrasions, it causes damage to blood vessels, and you have that reddish look and maybe even some blood around the area. If it was post-mortem, the injuries would be more of a yellowish brown because the blood wasn't pumping through the body, and that's not what we have there. So that's how she can determine pre and post. Um, she said that if John O'Keefe would have been hit by a car, you would expect to have seen tissue crushed, bruising. You wouldn't have these parallel abrasions. On the arm, you might have an array of irregular, unpredictable, randomly scattered cuts and scrapes at variable depths and angles. They wouldn't all just be that one direction, as we see on John O'Keefe's arm. Then they get into something interesting. They talk about x rays. And we see AJ, Alan Jackson, bring out a scroll of x rays. They're just rolled up and they're big sheets of physical x rays that he's had, printed. And we're like, I thought there weren't any x rays. Welcher said that he didn't see any x rays of the arm. And so you have to wonder, is it because the Commonwealth didn't give those to Welcher to review? Because then maybe he would have had to come up with a different scenario, and that arm x-ray doesn't go along with their theory. Or Welcher lied about x-rays, or he didn't remember an arm x-rays, but he did remember like pelvis and other things. He just says he didn't remember seeing an arm x-ray. So he's like, we don't know what his arm looked like. We don't have any x-rays of it. And a lot of us were thinking, well, that's a good point for the Commonwealth. Why wouldn't they take any x-rays of the arm? Especially if they took x-rays of other things. Because the arm is a huge point of contention in this case. It seemed odd. But at the same time, we're like, well, sometimes the Commonwealth's people don't do their job. But no, Scorty Bello did her job. So another thing that Hank Brennan just gets up there and says shit and allows his witnesses to say things that he knows are not true. It should have been corrected on the record. So Alan Jackson, instead of questioning, or Alessi didn't question Welcher. He waited because they knew they had the x-rays and they were going to bring out the x-rays in their case in chief with their witnesses to say, the Commonwealth expert told you there were no x-rays. Here we are as the defense showing you that is not true. Here are x-rays. So that Commonwealth witness misled you or lied to you. Somebody was not being truthful over there. Somebody was trying to hide things from you, jury. So he brings the x-rays in. Um, and she says, there were no breaks, there were no bony defects, they were 100% intact, there were no abnormal tissue swelling in the arm, and that's pretty much the end of her direct. Hank Brennan gets up. He starts off by talking about thrusting backwards. You know that John O'Keefe was thrust backwards. And he wants to say thrust because it sounds like it needs a lot of force to be thrust backwards instead of it just being fell backwards. And Laposata's like, I don't really know what you are meaning when you say thrust. Like he fell backwards, but I don't know what you mean he was thrusted. Um, so that becomes weird and awkward. She asks if, or Hank Brennan asks her if an MRI or a CT is better or equal to physically holding the brain in your hand and cutting into the brain. Would an MRI and a CT be just as good? Well, a CT is not going to be just as good. An MRI would probably be one of the better tools, and there might even be a better one than that when it comes to brains, if on an alive person, because obviously we're not usually going to be cutting into things of the brain. When neurosurgeon can work on things, but we're not usually going to deal with that in an alive person. And she says, no, the gold standard is actually, to be able to physically hold and examine the brain in your hands. But he thinks that imaging would be better. Don't ask questions you don't know the answer to, Hank. He tells her she isn't a neurosurgeon. Later, he tells her she isn't a biomedical engineer, as well as she's not an accident reconstructionist. Okay. No, she's not. She just examines a body. I don't know many coroners that are also accident reconstructionists. That's not usually part of the autopsy in regards to the body. Uh, tells her she doesn't work on living brains. She's like, no, I just deal with dead brains. They talk about that 15 to 20 minutes that John O'Keefe would have been dead in and her opinions. Asked if she thought that John O'Keefe could be saved and the percentage, oh, if he would have just been driven to a trauma center and, he could have been saved. And she's like, yeah, we don't know that for certain. And usually people with this injury, not really. And Hank's, but it's a possibility. Sir, you're not supposed to be dealing with possibilities. But this is him trying to prove that if Karen Reed wouldn't have left him there and she would have got him help, he would have been able to survive. And the thing is, from the looks of this injury and the way his brain reacted and his brainstem and all that, it actually doesn't look like he would have survived. If you think about if she would have done this, and if she would have called for help, you have her trying to deal with him, then her calling 911, the time it takes for 911 to get there in this blizzard or whatever, then the time that it would take them to do whatever they need to do on scene, put him in the ambulance, and then drive to the hospital. By the time he got to the hospital, he would probably be gone either way with John O'Keefe's injury. So whether Karen Reed did anything or didn't do anything, if she had hit him, it really wouldn't have made a difference in this case. We're not talking about other cases and different things. In this case, that was not likely to be the outcome. He asks her if she's read a study done by Dr. Isaac Wolf, which we've done a video on him. He was the neurosurgeon that came in and testified on behalf of the Commonwealth, and the one that was like, "Yeah, I see drunk people fall down in the snow all the time with these head injuries." Ye She hadn't read the study by this neurosurgeon. She might later. Um, Talks about, "Do you know what's under the frozen grass?" She says, "Yes, dirt." "You don't know what's under the grass. That there's dirt under the grass. There's soil." He's like, "Well, you don't know if there's any, like, rocks or bumps or impediments, like little pebbles," and this is where he's talking about these granular things that would give a granular impression. Um, she says, "Well, I looked at pictures and I didn't see any of that stuff." And he's like, "But you didn't go out to the scene and see." She's like, "No, I didn't go out to the scene and see." Um, she's been a little snarky at this point, back to Hank Brennan, like, I don't really care what you're saying, that's just not what happened." And Laposata seems to be like, "I know you think you're trying to be smarter than me, or you think you know more than me, Hank Brennan, but you actually don't have any idea what you're talking about when it comes to the medical stuff." Is kind of the vibe I was getting from her, thinking that, "What is this fool trying to get me to say? Like, does he even know what he's talking about? Because his sentences don't make any sense." Then he talks about the brain and he asks if the brain is soft like tofu. And she says, "Ew, gross. No, not any tofu that I've messed with. I don't know about you, but not me." It was really funny because she was, "Ew, gross." She's very girly in that moment. Um, they ask about, "Do you know anything about dog DNA or hair on the vehicle, the debris field, all the taillight that was in the yard, and the shoe that was on one foot and the other one was found at the scene, the hat, his pants, stains that he has." And she's like, "Well, I didn't notice any like grass stains on the pants." She noticed like blood and stuff. She did talk about the gurney, and blood could go down on the gurney, which to me still doesn't explain the front of his shirt and how blood got there. That still needs to be explained, because if he started bleeding once he fell backwards, I don't understand the front of the shirt having blood on it. Um, that's weird to me, because gravity would make it fall this way if he was standing up down his shirt and stuff, but if he was backwards, the blood would go to the sides. So the blood pattern and stains on his shirt don't even make sense for this. Um, "Did you look at the cell phone data and the Lexus data?" And she said, "No." "Did you look at the speed of the vehicle?" She says, "He wasn't hit by a vehicle, so the speed doesn't matter." "Did you consider how fast or slow the car was going?" She said, "It doesn't matter how fast the car was going. He didn't get hit by a car." And this is the time where Russell got to say, you know, "I don't believe he got hit by a car. It's not consistent with the car." The medical examiner got to say it wasn't consistent with the car accident. Lapasato flat said he didn't get hit by a car. "I don't care what that car was doing, because this man was not hit by a car. His injuries show that there was no collision." She's adamant about it. Then he tries to get into discrediting her. Before she testified, there was a little bit of a voir dire. And then before he gets to this part of the questioning, they have another voir dire. Um, and the voir dire was concerning, to say the least. The way Hank Brennan was laying it out, that she had resigned, um, after all of this stuff went down with a fire, and they wanted her on the scene they've been wanting her on the scene for 17 hours, and she never went, and that there was, like, some audit or something that happened, and there were tons and tons of reports and things that weren't done, and all of this stuff, and it was like, "Hmm." Then at the end of the voir dire, we found out that Hank Brennan has actually used this witness before. I think Alan Jackson said he's used her like 5 or 6 times, and Hank Brennan was like, "It was not 5 or 6 times, it was several times." Like, it was only 3, or it was a few times, sorry, not several, few. Several is about 5 or 6, few is 3. Um, okay, excuse, that's not 5 or 6, just 3 or 4, but you've used her, and then he said something about, "And I don't use her anymore." Well, is that because she doesn't lie for you? Is that because she's not gonna say what you want her to say? She can't be a paid witness? Um, I don't know. So, then the jury comes back in, and Hank is allowed to ask her questions about this, and, he's like, "You worked the station night fire, you did the autopsies in that case?" And she says, "Yes," and talk about, "Well, didn't they want you on scene?" She's like, "Well, I had, my lead investigator out there on the scene. I didn't necessarily physically have to be out there. We had somebody from our office out there." It's like, "But they wanted you out there." And she's like, "Well, I didn't need to be out there. I was back at the autopsy office and getting everything ready for the slew of people we were gonna have coming in." And he talks about, "Well, wasn't there a bunch of stuff in the media?" And she's like, "Yeah, it was a bunch of bullshit." She said bullshit straight up in court. She's like, there was a lot of political stuff, a new, I believe they said governor had come in. They There was a new person trying to tell her different things, and they wanted quantity over quality. Um, and they had cut her budget and things like that. And she thinks that each person is important and they deserve, things to be done the way they should be done. And she was not going to compromise the integrity of her work due to the new person running things, budget cuts, and things that they were wanting her to do. So she resigned. And then she went and worked, or she opened up her own practice. Oh, I gotta plug my laptop in just one moment. Okay. Sorry about that. I had to plug my computer in. Okay. So she opened her own practice. And he's like, she opened a consulting firm. And he's like, "Well, what percentage do you consult on cases?" She's like, "Well, it's a consulting firm. So I would say about 100% of my business is consulting." 'Oh, how much consulting?" "Well, it's a consulting firm, sir. So that's what the business is for consulting." I think she said, they do both civil and criminal cases. I don't remember the exact percentage. It might have been about 50-50, but, um and so that was him trying to discredit her with something that sounded really bad, possibly in voir dire. And then when Hank gets in front of the jury and talks about it and she gives her answers, it doesn't seem like quite as big of a deal. Um, Sounds like bullshit, as Dr. Laposata said. And then um, they talk about glass on the nose and the cut of the nose. Um, Hank Brennan finishes his cross, and Alan Jackson gets back up, and she asks, that little cuts and things, could they be from a punch? Hank Brennan did want her to get like, well, is glass sharp, or could it be glass, or could it be plastic? And Alan Jackson said, objected to plastic because the only thing in evidence is Karen Reed saying she pulled a piece of glass off of his nose. And she said it started gushing blood, which is interesting because if John O'Keefe is already passed, it shouldn't have been gushing blood. Um, we don't know if it is glass or a piece of plastic. We don't know how it got there. Um, but gets her to say that glass is sharp. Okay. But it's thicker, and it was like it had to do with like the thickness and how it could cause something, and the sharpness, and it was like a big round and circle thing, but basically glass is sharp. Okay. Then Alan Jackson is talking about, do you know how tall John O'Keefe is? And I saw a bunch of people online were like, oh, she's so dumb. And because she said 5'11" and she said 7'2" or something like that. The thing is when she says 5'11" or 7'2", she's talking about 72 inches, which is 6 feet tall. So she's talking about 72 inches, not him being 7 feet 2 inches tall. That's not what she's saying. Um, but if people knew what 72 inches was, then maybe they wouldn't have misunderstood that. Um, mm, 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 mm. So that's what they talked about, their height. They again get into talking about the body temperature of a deceased person and the lowering of their body temperature as opposed to an alive person in the cold and their body temperature dropping, which to me was very interesting because I've been waiting for somebody to talk about that. When you die, your body goes cold. But yeah, it could also go cold from laying in cold temperatures, below freezing temperatures. So they talk about the body temp, 80 degrees rectal when they took it at the hospital. 95 degrees is considered hypothermia technically. But that's just the start of it. And that from 98.6 degrees to 80 degrees, it is a little over 18 degrees drop in that 5.5 hours. But you also have to remember um, his body got warmed up to 80 degrees, so it possibly could have dropped below that and was less than that until they warmed him up. She talks about if they're alive and in the cold, the body temperature could drop a degrees to a half a degree, or a degree to a degree and a half when he's alive. But if the body is in temperatures that are cold and they're dead, it could drop 4 degrees for every hour. So that's a big difference. Um, that the body, whether it's outside or inside, if the inside is cold or a garage or a basement is cold, just like outside, even though there may not be the same amount of cold, the body doesn't know where it's at. And if you remember, deceased bodies, even in inside temperature controlled areas, the body is still going to end up cold. But when you're deceased, the body temperature will get colder at a more rapid pace. The 3 to 4 degrees as opposed to a degree to a degree and a half every hour. So that was something that was very interesting to me. And that is kind of where Alan Jackson and stuff leaves it. And Hank Brennan tries to get in there and confuse things on this. But to go from, a particular degree to what John O'Keefe's body was to them warming it up to get it to an 80 degrees, how how much did his body temperature actually decrease? It would have been interesting had they had taken the temperature before they started warming him up to see where it was. I don't know if that's something they do, but that is something extra they could have done, and then we could have known how much they warmed it up from. Or was he still at 80 degrees even being in the snow? Um, but we don't know that. So that is Dr. Laposata. She was a little spitfire firecracker. She had some great moments, um, but she was calm. She was still soft spoken and stuff. Um, but she didn't give Hank an inch. He didn't really score points with her. So she, to me, was a great defense witness. Um, Somebody we didn't have last year for trial one. I think she made a huge difference in this one. So that is going to be it for me on this witness, and I will see you next time. Bye. Turn that off. There we go.